Hi, I'm Dave Juvet. I'm a Senior Vice President for Public Policy with the Business and Industry Association, New Hampshire's statewide Chamber of Commerce, and I'd like to welcome you to BIA Perspective, where we take an in-depth look at legislative issues that impact New Hampshire's business community. The BIA is a nonpartisan organization, but we are pro-business, and our mission is to promote a healthy climate for job creation and a strong New Hampshire economy. The 2019 legislative session will be winding down over the next month, and tonight we're going to be focusing on a number of high-profile issues still in play this session, including the cost of electricity, workforce housing, and business taxes. To help me drill down on these issues, I'm very pleased to be joined by several colleagues of mine who are no strangers to public policy issue development in New Hampshire, and allow me to introduce them. Marc Brown is president of the New England Ratepayers Association. He provides consulting services to free market organizations on energy, education, and small business regulatory policies, and he has testified many times for local, state, and federal bodies on matters relating to energy and education. Ben Frost is the Director of Legal and Public Affairs at New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. He's a founding member of Housing Action New Hampshire, a low-income housing advocacy organization, and he has been engaged in the practice of municipal law in New Hampshire for over 2 decades. And Teresa Rosenberger is the president of Divine Strategies, a consulting group at Divine, Willamette, and Branch, and a registered lobbyist in New Hampshire. She's been involved in utility management, deregulation and rate cases, public policy tax issues, and efforts to defeat onerous initiatives on businesses. Thank you all for being here tonight. Marc, let me start with you. The issue of energy and electricity is one that has occupied a lot of attention at the State House, and that's true this session. There are a couple of bills that have impacts on the cost of electricity, which is already high in New Hampshire. Can you fill us in on a few of those?
Sure. I would say the two biggest ones are probably Senate Bills 124 and Senate Bills 168. Senate Bill 124 these are both renewable portfolio standards bills. For those that don't know, renewable portfolio standards are basically the requirements that utilities and suppliers purchase a certain percentage of electricity from, favored renewable energy resources.
Things like wind power
Wind,
or solar.
Yep. Small scale hydro and biomass are generally the four, there's 4 different classes, and those pretty much represent them.
And what is the issue with this?
Senate Bill 124 wants to increase the renewable portfolio standard. So at the end of 2025, we're essentially at 25 by 25, which means that 25% of our load has to be made up of renewable energy resources. And they want to increase that the legislature does, maybe they do, from 60% to 60% by 2040.
And what is the implication of doing that? Because it sounds great. We should all be supporting sustainable energy, but what is the but?
The but is, just to keep it simple, is at the tail end of this, kind of a worst case scenario type situation, but you're looking at $300 million a year increase in electricity costs.
So
that's going to ramp up to that level, obviously.
Because these forms of energy are more expensive.
They are more expensive. You're paying what's called renewable energy credits. So you're not just paying for the energy, you're paying for the renewable energy credits as well.
So it could have a tremendous impact on the cost of electricity, which is already the highest in the country in this state.
It could. For a large manufacturer, you're talking over $1 million a year in additional electricity costs.
And it'll even impact residential customers. That electricity would be
everybody. It impacts everybody.
Yep. All right. Ben, you and I have worked on workforce housing issues for a long time. Can you just briefly describe why workforce housing is an issue? What is the impact on communities and especially employers across the state? Why should businesses be interested in this?
Well, Dave, it seems like everyone is talking about housing. Business New Hampshire magazine runs a housing crisis cover story, and I hear legislators talking about issues related to housing, and it's all because of the impact of the housing market on the broader economy we have in New Hampshire. Historically, housing construction has been a really important employer. It's been a driver of what goes on in much of New Hampshire's economy. And what we've witnessed over the past many years, I would say the last 15 years, is a real decline in housing construction, maybe 20 years, especially in single-family housing construction. We have a deficit in New Hampshire relative to what we need in housing of something on the order of 20 to 30,000 units of housing, whether it's rental housing or homes for people to purchase. And what that means is for businesses that are trying to expand, they want to hire more people to fill jobs, but if those people can't find a place to live, then they're not going to be moving to New Hampshire to take those jobs. And we see employers like the Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center facing hiring problems at all levels of employment there, not just the orderlies and the people doing the lower level paying jobs, but physicians as well, residents, are choosing to go elsewhere.
Right, I think it's important to distinguish when we talk about workforce housing, we're not talking about subsidized housing or, you know, what people refer to as Section 8 or anything like that. We're talking about housing for working people, people of all salary levels, to be able to own a home or afford a rental unit.
Right, and some of those might be subsidized. In fact, a lot of the people who live in subsidized housing, they're either elderly, disabled, or they're working, and they just work low-level, low-paying jobs, and so they need a place to live that's fairly decent. But it does include what we might characterize as middle-income housing as well.
Mm-hmm. What is the issue? Why isn't housing being built? What is disrupting the law of supply and demand? And is there a legislative effort to try and remedy that?
Well, Dave, there are a lot of different things that impact upon housing construction, the cost of materials, the availability of skilled labor, contractors to do the work. And a lot of those things are beyond our control. We can't control the price of lumber in New Hampshire, but we can control some of the regulations that impinge upon housing construction. And by that, I'm mostly talking about local regulation, zoning, for example. We have been hearing from developers for decades that they have real difficulty, not just in getting projects approved at the local level, but then what happens if they get denied? Say a planning board denies a subdivision approval or a zoning board of adjustment denies a variance. Where do they go? They have to go to Superior Court. And while that might serve the needs of some appeals, a Superior Court case can take upwards of a year and a half, sometimes 2 years. And for developers, time really is money. And they lose the opportunity. They're holding this property for a while. And the longer they're in litigation, the more they're spending to hold on to the property before they can build. And it's just too costly for some of them to do that. And so they walk away, or they choose not even to propose developments in some communities where they know they're not going to be treated as well as others.
So the BIA and other housing advocates has been focused on legislation this session that we think is a reasonable approach to dealing with that issue. Can you talk a little bit about the Housing Appeals Board and how that's
Sure.
structured?
This is Senate Bill 306. The prime sponsor is Senator Bob Guida. It has bicameral and bipartisan support, leadership in both chambers, so we're really happy with that. There was a bill in the last session that passed the Senate and then got hung up in the House Finance Committee, and Senator Guida made another run at it this year. The Senate passed this legislation and then tabled it to include in the budget. What Senate Bill 306 does is it creates a housing appeals board, which would provide an alternative appeals venue for developers or anyone, frankly, who wants to appeal a decision of a municipality.
Faster and less expensive than going
Faster,
through the
less
courts.
expensive by a 3-member expert panel, but using the same tests that are applied by the Superior Court. So there's some concern that this is an infringement on local control, that it will change how local planning boards make their decisions. It doesn't at all. It applies the same legal standards that are used by the Superior Court.
Teresa,
Yes.
one of the biggest issues this session is the state budget, the 2-year budget. It's been passed by the House. It's currently in the Senate, in Senate Finance, and they're looking at both House provisions that were included in the budget and also some of their own ideas. Can you talk a little bit about what's in the budget? Not everything, because it's massive, but high-profile things that would impact businesses in New Hampshire.
Well, there's a lot in that budget, and there's no question in the budget they have the Family Medical Leave Act, which the governor has vetoed. That looks like it'll raise its head in the budget. Business taxes, the BPT and the BET, business profits tax and business enterprise tax, have been frozen at the 2018 level.
And we should
As you-
explain
yes.
that they were on a
Yes.
ramp.
I was going to say, as you recall, a number of years ago, it was signed into law that the BET and BPT would steadily decrease. And so the decrease for 2019 is not going to happen. They're freezing it at 2018 levels. So, I mean, that's an issue, needless to say. But at least they didn't take it backwards. The House was trying to roll it back even farther. The capital gains tax, there's been an effort to have a capital gains tax of 5%, just like the interest and dividends tax.
Right, which would be a new tax
It's
for New
a
Hampshire.
new tax for New Hampshire. I don't think you'll see that at the end of the day. The one that's being talked about right now, and this is a little bit of a tax nerdy issue, is apportionment. We've been trying since, I think, at least I started working on it in 1995, to get a single sales factor passed in the state. Looks like the Senate has passed, the House looks like they will pass a market-based apportionment, and that basically is going to probably not impact New Hampshire businesses, but it will impact businesses that are coming from out of state. It looks like on top of that, they're going to do something called conformity with the federal IRS code. A couple of years ago, we tried to make New Hampshire conform with the federal tax code. We were in 2008. They took it to 2014. Right now, if they conform to the current tax code, it will be a win for New Hampshire with more revenue coming in. Obviously, somebody's paying that. I don't know who. And the third part of it is a single sales factor, which is actually positively impacting a lot of out-of-state businesses, not so sure in-state businesses. The issue with this is really nobody, including DRA, can tell you what the impact's going to really be. I would say they've done kind of a clever job of hitting one group here, another group there, a little bit in the middle. I think you'll see that raise its head. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. And the real question for the business community is, when you hear about this, call your tax people, your accountants, ask them how it actually impacts you. But I think you'll see some of that. What else is out there? Obviously, you've got a real push with Senate Bill 308 to increase the Medicaid reimbursement rates. The 5% the first year, and I think 7% the second year, those are big dollars.
Now, why is that important to businesses
Well, it's important to the hospitals. It's the hospitals,
who are
anybody,
big employers?
hospitals, nursing homes, any healthcare providers that take Medicaid. Our rates are the lowest in the country. So obviously, if you are if you're being reimbursed what your costs are, then there's cost shifting. So who pays?
Everybody
Business.
else.
Everybody, business and those who don't have insurance. So you're seeing that. You're seeing a number of other healthcare issues out there, the mental health situation. A lot of these are, and DCYF with kids, a lot of these are big ticket financial items.
Well, since we're talking about the budget, and you brought up a couple of issues, one you mentioned early on was paid family leave. Some people might be aware that the governor recently vetoed Senate Bill 1, which was a standalone mandatory paid family leave program. The language in the budget that was passed by the House is similar, not identical, but very similar.
Very similar.
What is the strategy at this point in terms of getting a budget through that has enough things in it to move the Democratic agenda forward, because they control the House and Senate, but balances with the Republican governor and what he would like to see? What happened? What do you? This is a free-for-all. So what do you folks think happens when this budget emerges from the legislature and goes to the governor?
Well, I kind of think on the business side, the fact that you're going to have a freeze on the business taxes, you're not increasing, or increasing them, and you're not decreasing. So you're in the middle there. Family medical leave, if it's voluntary, I would think that
Which the language in the
might-
budget
that's
currently is
right.
not.
Right, exactly. And currently, there's some issues in that language with flexibility. There's some real issues for the business community with the way the bill's written now. And I will say, I work for a law firm, and our employment lawyers are getting calls continually from big and small businesses saying, well, how does this impact? And the staffing's a real issue there. How do you, if you're small, how do you have predictability? If you're big, you've got a lot of employees. But, so maybe if they do it voluntary, what do you guys think?
I think voluntary is the only way that's going to get.
I think that's
the
exactly
only way that's
right.
going to get through.
That's exactly right.
Ben, there's another budget issue relating to housing, and that's some new funding for the housing fund that your agency administers. Where is that in this process?
Well, Governor Sununu, in his budget proposal, included a $5 million appropriation to the state's Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
And that fund is meant to provide some gap funding for developers to help move projects forward.
It's very flexible funding for us to use to help finance multifamily rental housing construction. And it's been around since 1988, but hasn't gotten a lot of funding, $17.6 million since that time. But it's a revolving fund, so there are some repayments that come back to us every so often. But this $5 million that the governor put in was a welcome starting place. The House, in its approved budget, also included the $5 million, so we're grateful for that. At the same time, Senator Bradley had a bill in that would make a $10 million one-time appropriation to the Affordable Housing Fund and an ongoing $5 million carve-out from the real estate transfer tax, which I'd say remarkably was supported by the New Hampshire Association of Realtors under the condition that the rate itself not be increased. So that was passed by the Senate and then went over to the House. Unlike most Senate appropriations bills, which got tabled, this went over to the House and a couple weeks ago had a 2-hour-long hearing with no one speaking in opposition.
Interesting.
The House Finance Committee then retained the bill, so it's all back to the budget now, and we're dying to find out what comes out the other end.
Well, I want you all to put your prognostication hats on now. We're all going to play the great Karnak and talk about the budget. And one option is the House and Senate pass a budget and the governor signs it. Another option is the House and Senate pass a budget and the governor vetoes it. Mark, let's start with you. What do you think will happen?
I think you see the House and Senate pass a budget and the governor will veto it. So.
I agree.
Ben?
Oh, gosh, I could be the outlier here.
Ah.
My vibes tell me that the governor and the Senate are beginning to work together and talk. Now, I don't know whether that's just what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing as far as body language. I think you're going to see a budget that's a little better coming out of the Senate from the governor's point of view than what came out of the House. To me, the real question is what's the House going to do? And
Right.
is the House going to hang really tight on some of these things that we know the governor will veto? Or will they accede to the Senate? I mean, there's some rumor that they'll just agree with the Senate and will go to the governor.
Those of us who work as lobbyists are hoping that, which is the path of least resistance,
Yeah,
is what
exactly.
happens.
We would like to have a June and not be there at midnight. So I don't know. I think the House is the question at the moment, and I don't know how
Interesting.
closely the Senate is working with the House or how closely the governor's office is working with the House. I don't know how they're being brought along. I do know what I talked about on the apportionment. I made a comment to one of them yesterday about it. So what do you think about it? They had no clue what I was talking about. So the question is, if they're not being brought along on things like that, then what are they going to do when all of a sudden it hits? And so,
Well, I
know.
guess we'll find out over the
find
course
out.
of the next month. We need to bring this segment of BIA Perspective to a close. I'd like to thank my guests, Marc Brown, Ben Frost, and Teresa Rosenberger for joining us and breaking down what are very complex subjects in a way that people like me can understand. So thank you very much. And thank you for watching. We appreciate you being a part of BIA Perspective. I'm Dave Juvet with the Business and Industry Association.